Hello everyone. Today we will be going over the second part of chapter 16 and talking about treatment of psychological disorders. And to start off with, we're going to talk about behavior therapies, and unlike psychodynamic therapy, which emphasizes early developmental processes as a source of psychological dysfunction, behavioral and cognitive treatments focus on the current factors which contribute to the problem. Primarily maladaptive behaviors and dysfunctional thoughts influence abnormal behavior. And so maladaptive behavior or thoughts are not suitable for surviving in a changing environment, and that's become a problem for the individual. So we live in a changing world, and if you're stuck in one way of thinking or behaving, then it will start to be problematic. So dysfunctional behaviors and thoughts are where individuals behave or act in ways that do not really facilitate social acceptance by other individuals or their peers. So behavior therapy focuses on the treatment of clients' observable behavior rather than on unconscious motives like in psychoanalysis. And disordered behavior, they believe, can be unlearned. And as such, most behavior therapy techniques are derived from learning principles such as operant conditioning principles or procedures, which focus on reinforcement and punishment, and also focus on classical conditioning procedures, which focus on extinction of learned behaviors. And so in order to increase behaviors you want in an individual, like children, for example, token economies are the go-to technique. In cases of depression, behavioral activation helps alleviate depressive symptoms. And so these are two of the behavior therapy techniques that we'll discuss in this slide. Sometimes if people are not doing the things we want them to do, we give them an incentive to do what we want them to do. So a token economy involves giving clients tokens for desired behaviors. And so, as I mentioned before, this works really well with kid clients, which they can later trade in these tokens for rewards. So following, this could be examples of following house rules. They'll get tokens for each rule that they follow, cleaning their rooms, exercising, or helping other people. These serve as positive reinforcement because they can be exchanged for incentives like TV privileges, goodies, or playing video games. So one example of a token economy is every time that Sophie reads a book, she gets a sticker. So when she gets 10 stickers, her parents take her to her favorite restaurant. And so that's an example of a token economy. Token economies have been found to be effective while the rewards are still in place, but usually people quit doing the desired behavior as soon as the reinforcement disappears. So relatedly, a technique used in behavior therapy is behavioral activation. And in order to decrease depressive symptoms and gain a sense of pleasantry and meaning, clients engage in pleasant events that are meaningful to their lives. And research has demonstrated that both of these techniques are effective. So when the problem we're dealing with is more about emotion rather than behavior, behaviorists often use exposure or systematic desensitization to reduce a person's fear or emotion. So exposure therapy involves confronting the feared or anxiety-provoking stimulus over repeated trials until the individual habituates to that stimulus or does not experience the level of anxiety as they did before. So Wolpe called this form of treatment systematic desensitization, and behaviorists would first teach the client relaxation techniques like deep breathing and muscle relaxation before exposing them to the anxiety-provoking stimulus. So this is based on the principle that, that you cannot be anxious and calm or relaxed at the same time. So behavior therapist who wants to help Andy, for example, overcome his debilitating anxiety following a bad car wreck would ask him to relax the muscles in his body while imagining getting closer and closer to the car. So with behavior techniques, we know that in vivo exposure is more effective than imaginary exposure, where we have the client actually in the situation that is provoking that anxiety, or facing the actual stimulus rather than just imagining being there. So it's better for that person to actually go to the dentist and practice relaxation than it is to imagine it. You'll do this systematically when we are putting individuals into these type of situations. So we'll face easier situation first, and as the fear or anxiety decreases, more difficult or frightening situations are encountered, as we'll see in the next slide. Exposure with response prevention is also important or key to these techniques. So response prevention allows for the person to stay in the situation or be confronted with the stimuli and not be able to escape. So one example of this is for someone with obsessive compulsive disorder. This may look like asking them to get their hands dirty on purpose and leave them dirty for hours until their anxiety comes down, and then they start to unlearn that association between dirt means whatever irrational thought that they held. So this helps to ensure that the individual learns that just because they get their hands dirty, that they will not get sick, or if they do, it will not be as bad as they once thought. So here we have an example of a hierarchy for an individual with a social phobia. In session, the therapist would ask the client to list the activities that cause distress to the client. After listing different activities that are distressing to the client would rate them from 0, no anxiety, to 100, where they are experiencing the worst anxiety ever. And from there, the client therapist would work from the bottom towards the top in incremental steps. So first, the client would ask for directions at the gas station. They would maybe ask to do this several times until their subjective unit of distress, or SUDS score, went down from a 35 to a 15. So after they successfully complete the first step, they move on to the next. So often, as we'll find out, the go-to psychotherapy for mood and anxiety disorders is cognitive behavioral therapy, in which techniques from both cognitive and behavior therapy are used. Cognitive therapy takes into account a person's thoughts and feelings and focuses on helping a client identify and correct any distorted thinking about themselves, other people, and the world. So, for example, behaviorists may explain a phobia as a result of being bitten by a dog, whereas a cognitive theorist may instead emphasize the individual's beliefs or assumptions about the event and the feared stimulus. For example, they may believe that all dogs are dangerous and all should be feared. Cognitive therapies use a principal technique called cognitive restructuring, which involves teaching clients to question their automatic beliefs, assumptions, and predictions that often lead to negative emotions, and to replace those negative thoughts with more beneficial, balanced thoughts and beliefs. So clients are taught to examine the evidence for and against a particular belief and to be more accepting of outcomes that may be undesirable, yet they can still manage them. So balanced thought may include, I'm not stupid and I'm not going to fail out of school even though I failed my last test. A more balanced thought would be, I have difficulty in my chemistry class and that is reflective of my test score, and as such I'll go out and I'll seek tutoring from student services. So that's more of a balanced thought. Other forms of cognitive therapy include techniques for coping with unwanted thoughts and feelings that resemble meditation. And one of these techniques is called mindfulness meditation. And it teaches an individual to be fully present in each moment and be aware of his or her thoughts, feelings, and sensations. And this has been especially helpful in preventing relapses of depression. And so here we have some common irrational beliefs and emotions, emotional responses that result from these thoughts. And these are common irrational beliefs that a lot of individuals tend to think like. And what we see here is, again, we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy being the go-to therapy or psychotherapy that often helps with decreasing depressive symptoms, depressive and anxiety, or anxious symptoms. And with CBT, the structure of therapy is highly structured. It's focused on the problem and working towards a client's goal by actively problem solving with the client. And therapy goals and reasoning behind the techniques that the therapist is using is shared with the client, and this really makes therapy transparent. So the client is in tune and they understand what exactly is going on and why they are doing the things they are in therapy. And so ultimately the client's goals for therapy guide treatment. And a lot of these principles for cognitive therapy were first developed by Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis. And so this will be important to understand that some of their work laid the foundational groundwork essentially for cognitive behavioral therapy. And so historically, cognitive and behavioral therapies were considered two distinct systems of therapy. Though some people continue to follow this distinction, a large percentage of therapists, especially those treating anxiety and depression, use a combination of both cognitive and behavioral techniques. So CBT acknowledges that there may be behaviors that people cannot control through rational thoughts, or irrational thoughts drive abnormal behavior. Example treatments for depression include challenging these automatic and distorted thoughts and creating alternative balanced thoughts. In addition to these irrational thoughts, a client would engage in behavioral activation or participating in pleasant events that are meaningful to the client, like spending time with their family or taking time out for themselves and taking a bubble bath, whatever the client has picked out for their pleasant event. Example treatments for anxiety may include not only challenging those irrational thoughts, such as an extreme fear of severe weather and all its associated anxious thoughts, like we're all going to be sucked up into the tornado, there's going to be an F5, so on. They would take those and challenge them, plus they would implement relaxation techniques and teach the client to how to deep breathe and how to relax their muscles. And in addition to that, they would expose them to feared stimuli, maybe like exposing them to thunderstorms or the sound of tornado sirens. And so when comparing CBT to psychoanalytic therapy, there are several major differences between the two. And these include the length of therapy, so CBT is short-term versus psychoanalytic therapy, which is long-term. The focus of treatment is on the client's present rather than their past. The therapist is seen as a coach or a trainer of techniques used to address the issue versus in psychoanalytic therapy where the therapist is seen as the expert on the client's life. And lastly, CBT is based on scientific evidence supporting its use in treating depression and anxiety and a wide host of psychological disorders versus psychoanalysis, subjective interpretation. So switching gears here, the chapter goes on to discuss humanistic and existential therapies. And with humanistic and existential therapies, these emerged in the middle of the 20th century, in part as a reaction to the negative views that psychodynamic theories held about human nature. And so humanistic and existential theories share the assumption that psychological problems stem from feelings of alienation and loneliness, and that these feelings can be traced to failures to reach one's own potential or from failures to find meaning in life. And so interest in these approaches peaked in the 1960s and 70s, but some therapists continue to use these approaches today. And the two most well-known types are person-centered therapy, which is a humanistic approach, and Gestalt therapy, which is an existential approach. Person-centered therapy, aka client-centered, was developed by psychologist Carl Rogers in the 1940s and 50s. It assumes that each individual is qualified to determine his or her own goals for therapy, and the therapist tends not to provide any advice or suggestions about what the client should be doing unless the client asks. So they use a lot of paraphrasing to mirror what the client's thinking and what they're verbalizing in their sentiments. So they may say, what I hear you saying is, what they're doing is they're paraphrasing what the client is saying. And what they believe is that with adequate support of the client, that the client will recognize the right thing to do and they will come to their own understanding of how to solve their own problem. So similarly, Gestalt therapists are enthusiastic and warm and towards their clients and reflect their impressions of the client during session. And Gestalt therapy emphasizes the experiences and behaviors that are occurring at the particular moment in the therapy session. So if a client is talking about something stressful that occurred last week, the therapist might shift the attention to the client's experience in the moment by asking, how do you feel as you described what happened to you? So how are you feeling now? This technique is known as focusing. And so clients are also encouraged to put their feelings into action. And so one way to do this is using the empty chair technique, in which the client imagines the other person, which could be a spouse, a coworker, a parent, whoever, is sitting in the empty chair across from them. The client then moves from chair to chair, role-playing what they would say in each person's position. And Gestalt therapy originated as a form of therapy, but now these techniques are more often used in counseling or life coaching to help people prepare for a new job or new family situations. And so in comparison to CBT, Humanistic and Gestalt therapists are non-challenging and supportive. And in particular, CBT therapists are actively challenging these thoughts that are distressing and keep the client from fully functioning. So the Humanistic and Gestalt therapists are more supportive and non-challenging, whereas the CBT are actively engaging the client and challenging those distorted thoughts. So additionally, instead of actively challenging these maladaptive thoughts, Humanistic and Gestalt therapists focus on the client becoming more aware of and taking responsibility of their own thoughts, behaviors, experiences, and feelings, rather than maybe even changing them, but just owning up to those thoughts. And so with that wraps up the second portion of Chapter 16.